Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Kennedy. I'm TEI's International President, and I'm pleased to welcome you to TEI's CTO Brunch Briefing. TEI's Corporate Tax Management Committee is revitalizing the Chief Tax Officer network at TEI. If you're the most senior person in your tax function and have not already done so, please join the Chief Tax Officer community in TEI Connect. Last month, we had an engaging discussion regarding what the future of the office looks like as returning to an in-person environment becomes possible. We also have an active discussion board where CTOs can ask questions and exchange information. I hope you all will take advantage of this valuable resource. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Pilar Mata, our TEI Director of Operations. TEI's brunch briefings are normally breakfast briefings in an in-person conference world, but they're designed to introduce leading professionals whose experience and perspective can inform your work by providing insights that you may not ordinarily be exposed to on a day-to-day basis. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Martin Sullivan, Chief Economist and Contributing Editor at Tax Analysts, whose 25 plus years of experience reporting for Tax Analysts has provided valuable insights regarding tax policy and our economy. Mr. Sullivan's the author of, among other things, Corporate Tax Reform, Taxing Profits in the 21st Century, published late last year by A-Press. And as we all know, he's a prolific author of economic analysis with Tax Analysts. He testifies regularly before Congress, appears on national TV and radio, and is often quoted in leading newspapers and magazines. Previously, he was an economist at the U.S. Treasury Department, the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, and a major accounting firm. Marty is also a recent recipient of a prestigious award from the National Taxpayers Association. Well-deserved, I'm sure. This morning, Marty will discuss the perils and pitfalls of President Biden's recovery plan and let us know what's in store for corporate taxes, infrastructure, and the national debt. For meeting attendees, if you have any questions of Marty, please use the Q&A feature. We'll try to get to these either during or at the end of Marty's remarks. Marty, welcome back to TEI.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody's having a good morning. And I will just try to walk you through some economic background, nothing too painful, that I hope will give you some perspective on where fiscal policy is going and in particular about the Biden plan. But let me just start off with some very technical information. I want you to remember three numbers: 8.6, 1.6, and 16. If you have that, that's all you need to know from now on. So it'll become apparent in a minute what those numbers are for. Remember, 8.6, 1.6, and 16. I'm going to try to put up my slides. Just give me a sec. There we go. Can you all see that, Jim?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. All right. The salient economic facts you need to know, I believe, are the following two items. The first is the jobs picture. These are just incredible numbers from a historical perspective, but we're looking at the recession caused by the pandemic, which began about February 2020. We had almost 159 million jobs in the United States. And then we lost 25 million jobs in 3 months, just an absolutely incredible decline. And we've been working our way back up gradually, thank the Lord. But we're still way below where we were at the peak about a year ago. We're still 8.6 million jobs short. So that's the 8.6 I was talking about. So even though the overall economy in terms of GDP has recovered pretty well, unemployment is still very high. And by the way, just don't even pay attention to the unemployment rate because that's a very distorted statistic. It's better just to look at the number of jobs. It gives you a better perspective on what the job situation is. Now let me move to the other salient economic fact. And here we're looking at interest rates. The interest rate is on the vertical axis. From 2000 to 2020, we're on the horizontal axis. And you don't need to be a major statistician to see a downward trend here. Interest rates are going down, down, down. And this has occurred despite an incredibly large government debt. So, and there's a lot of, so what we've been expecting all of this time with increased government debt is that interest rates should be going up, but they're going down. So we have another very peculiar situation. So we have 8.6 million jobs lost, and our interest rate now, at least as of this morning, is about 1.6%. Even though that is a recent rise, it is still fantastically low on from a historical perspective. So let's talk, before we talk about the recovery part of the Biden plan, let's look at the rescue plan that was just enacted, that 1.9 trillion. Now, this is one way to look at it. You can see the breakdown of that $1.9 trillion spend. The economic impact payments, the stimulus checks were very, very large. Expanded child credit was very large. And then, of course, state and local government aid. But I think the better way to look at it is with the following slide, which is we're looking at the distribution of benefits in the recent American Rescue Package. That's in the light blue. And you can see it is fantastically tilted to the lowest income folks. The child credit, the earned income tax credit, the $1,400 stimulus payments, and then all of the spending programs. The benefits of this bill are very heavily tilted to low-income folks. And you can compare that to the TCJA, which was more even, and in fact, tilted to the upper income folks. All right. Now, this chart shows you all the legislation that's been enacted in the last year to address the pandemic. And there's been 6 different bills. The first 2 were very small, but then we come to the CARES Act, the third one down. And I apologize, the dates are wrong. The year is wrong on the date enacted for some of them. The first 5 were in 2020, and the last one was in 2021. But the CARES Act came in, and it cost an amazing $1.7 trillion, which is about 8% of GDP. Just fantastically large numbers. Then we had a follow-up to that, which was 2.3% of GDP. Then at the end of last year, we had yet more aid, another 5% of GDP. And if you, and then of course the rescue package, which was just enacted, is 1.9 trillion, $1.8 trillion, almost 9% of GDP. Now, what's 9% of GDP? You know, it's kind of hard to get your arms around that. One way to think about it is it's $5,500 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. So instead of enacting this legislation, we could have given every man, woman, and child a check for $5,500. When you sum these all together, you get close to $5.3 trillion, or 25% of GDP. Well, what is that? Well, that's, instead of enacting all of this legislation for the same cost, we could have given every man, woman, and child in the United States $16,000 in cash. So that just gives you an idea of the order of magnitude that government, how much the government is getting involved in this. And one of my colleagues who I showed these numbers to said, well, I think he was thinking I was trying to be liberal. He goes, well, why don't we do it in terms of tax cuts instead? So why don't we give every American a tax cut of $16,000? And of course, we could do that as well. But that just gives you an idea of the order of magnitude involved. Now, the size of that, is that stimulus too large, too small? What are we worried about? Well, just looking at the American Rescue Plan, which is close to 1.9 trillion, when we do the basic economics of how far up we can reach before we reach full capacity in the economy and get inflation and interest rates spiraling up, it's a very soft and hard number to estimate, but it's all that was really needed in the standard textbook model was about $1 trillion of stimulus. And now you could say it might be 500 billion or 1.5 trillion, but what seems clear to anybody who does the standard textbook analysis that this rescue package was probably too large. When you mention this to the Biden folks and their supporters, they get very angry. They don't want to hear that. They want to say, you're probably not estimating it right. And there may be some truth to that. As you know, economics is not a hard science. It's a lot of guesswork and estimation with a lot of politics mixed in just to make it interesting. But the standard textbook model says we are overstimulating the economy. And as big as that $5.3 trillion of cumulative stimulus is, there's another factor that we have to keep in mind. On this chart is monthly savings by US individuals. And amazingly, until the pandemic hit, it was about $100 billion a month was being saved. Look at this incredibly steady rate. And then when the pandemic hit and folks got stimulus payments, but maybe they weren't able to go shopping anymore or go to restaurants anymore or go on vacation anymore. So all of a sudden the savings rate just skyrocketed, as you can see from this chart. And cumulatively over the last year, Americans have saved $1.6 trillion more. Now, I'll ask you this question. If you haven't been on vacation and you haven't been to restaurants in the last year because of the pandemic, are you going to go out and have twice as many meals and maybe go on twice as many vacations next year when it's all safe, or are you just going to go back to your regular pattern? My son is going to visit me this weekend, and last year he did not come because of the pandemic. It's his birthday, and I said, we're going to have 2 birthday parties for you to make up for the one that was lost. So, but the reason to bring that up is, will this pent-up savings be unleashed on the economy in addition to the stimulus that we already have there? And of course, I think it's fair to say that a lot of it will be the accelerated spending. And so not only do we have this $5.3 trillion of government stimulus, we have this built-in $1.6 trillion just sitting there ready and on the runway. So and that's why you're hearing from almost everybody, we are going to have a booming economy this year, maybe 6% growth, which is extremely large. And there's going to be inflationary pressure and interest rates are going to go up. And that's a very good prediction. That's a very good way of looking at things. And but it hasn't happened yet. So we'll have to wait and see. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, now that Mr. Biden has passed his rescue plan, he's going to move to his recovery plan. And his recovery plan has 2 major parts. One is, let's talk about, one is tax increases. Those tax increases come in 2 categories. One is on high income individuals. And here we're talking about raising rates and doing everything in the book to increase capital gains taxation, increase their rate, get rid of step up in basis of death, which is the major change, and also to get rid of like-kind exchanges. So that's in the offing for individuals. And on the corporate side, we're talking about an array of corporate tax increases. There's 5 parts to that. I'm going to talk about that later. But we have all these tax increases. And then on the flip side, the good news is we're going to pay for infrastructure, roads, bridges, maybe some fiber optic cable or however they transmit the internet these days. And but also there's a question about what is infrastructure, what is, and if you talk to conservatives, it's the stuff on the left, the bridges, the roads. But if you talk to more liberal-minded folks, they're talking about, well, you know, investing in education, in childcare, in healthcare is also an investment in an infrastructure. Now, I'm not going to try to resolve that debate, but what I will say as a general economic statement is that if we increase our deficits and debt to build stuff that's going to last and increase our productivity, whether it's a bridge or it's childhood education, that's money well spent. It's very different from taking money and spending it on, let's say, and it's nothing against, I'm an old person, so nothing against old people, but spending it on Social Security, that's just going to be consumption and it's not going to help economic growth. So I am not particularly worried about increasing the debt if we're going to use it for productive investment, like a bridge, or if you believe it's true, and there are a lot of studies that do support this, childhood education, training, and so forth is a good public investment. So we have, just to think about it for a second, we have stimulus, which we badly needed. That is a proper use, I believe, of the deficit. We have infrastructure, which is going to be paid for with tax increases, according to Biden and his staff. But I don't even think you need to do that because if you are truly spending it on productive investment, that's money well spent, and it can be deficit financed. But if it is going to be used for, let's say, expanding Social Security, then we have a problem in terms of our economics. And so the key question is, what's going to happen to the long-term debt? Now here is a chart of the debt to GDP ratio. It's from the CBO. And you can see that before the pandemic, we were at about 80%, which is very high by historical standards. But the pandemic hit, tax receipts went down, both because of the declining economy and because of the tax cuts. And we spent a lot more money, and voila, in 1 year, the debt to GDP ratio jumps an incredibly large amount to just about 100% debt to GDP ratio. Now, here's where I want you to put on your thinking cap for a second. And by the way, just factually, this is before the American Rescue Plan. These are the latest numbers, but if you did include the American Rescue Plan, all of these numbers would jump up in a parallel manner, but it's the pattern that's important. So notice that the debt to GDP ratio is amazingly stable for the next 7 years. And so why is that? You know, if we could just stay stable, that's a good thing. We know we're okay at 100% of at this level, and if we could stay at that level, there's no reason to fear the future. We would say the debt and deficit is sustainable. But what is causing this pattern? Well, as you all know, interest rates have been fantastically low. At the same time, our deficits have been fantastically high. Now, one thing to distinguish are increases in the deficit that are due to the pandemic and other crises, like we had 8 years ago, or from sustained increases due to structural features in our deficit. So we have a one-time increase because we had the stimulus. Well, we're still on a sustainable path in that case. What is going on here, you see this leveling out, but there's really two forces working in opposite directions that keep us in this sort of equilibrium path. On the one hand, we have very large spending long-term in the form of increased Social Security payments and Medicare. That is the root cause of our long-term deficit problems. And so and at the same time, we have very low interest rates. So these two things are offsetting each other and keeping our debt to GDP ratio stable. So as we look into the future, we have to ask ourselves, are interest rates going to stay low? And is our spending going to stay high? Well, let's just talk about the spending part. That's easier to predict because demographics are relatively easy to forecast. Our population is aging. More and more folks are living longer. Bad news from an economic point of view. And therefore, spending on Social Security and Medicare is going to skyrocket. That is the root cause of our long-term deficit problem. Now, what about interest rates? What's going to happen with that? And let me just show you the next slide. Now, that last set of numbers was a real CBO forecast. This set of numbers, and I'll explain it to you, is my hypothetical forecast for the future. And all you need to know about the path of future of the debt to GDP ratio, which is on the vertical axis, is what is going to happen to the growth rate of the economy compared to the interest rate. Now, and those two rates hover around each other. Growth rate, G is the growth rate of the economy, R is the general interest rate. If those two numbers are the same, and if therefore the difference is equal to 0, we're going to be on that solid line. And what's going on there is what's causing our deficits, what's causing this increase is our spending, our current spending on social services. What's going on with the other two lines is how the economy can affect that. So if interest, on the green line on top, if interest rates rise and the growth rate does not, we're going to start to spiral out of control. We're going to go up in that exponential growth path. That's something we really want to avoid. The debt will explode. The flip side of that is, what if interest rates are very low compared to the growth rate? Well, then we kind of get on this nice stable path where things aren't going to be so bad. We are, in fact, now on that blue line. We are in a good situation, so to speak, where we can spend and not feel too much pain in terms of rising deficits. So, in short, what's making all of this happen is our incredibly low interest rates, going back to that 1.6%. Now, will interest rates stay low? Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd have a different job and be making a lot more money. But what it can do is, and what other economists have done, is they've studied what they believe is going to happen based on a bunch of factors. And let me just mention a few because I think it's important. It's going to be A, B, C, D. Very hard. A stands for aging. The population is aging. People are retiring. People have longer retirement periods, so they're saving more in anticipation of their longer post-work experience. So, and that increase in savings is keeping our interest rates low. And there's no reason to expect life expectancies to go down in the long term. So that would contribute to our interest rates staying low. Also, birth rate. B is birth rates. Birth rates are declining, which means the population is going to generally shrink. The workforce is going to shrink, and long-term investment opportunities are going to increase. So the demand for loanable funds is going to go down. C stands for China. The Chinese are it's a high savings economy, and as that economy grows, the availability of savings and loanable funds on worldwide markets increases. And D stands for distribution. The distribution of income is becoming increasingly uneven. And as that happens, because rich people save more than poor people, the amount of savings can be expected to increase. Now, nobody can predict the future, but these trends are generally going to be maintained. And so there's some reason to believe that interest rates will stay low. That's not a prediction, that's just sort of framing the issue for us. Now, in the olden days, like 10 or 15 years ago, we said, oh, when the government debt goes up, interest rates go up. Well, as you can recall from the third slide that I showed you, over the last 20 years, deficits have been growing and growing and growing, but interest rates have been going down, down, down. How can that be? Well, as ginormous as the government deficit is, it's not the only factor which affects interest rates. And these four trends that I mentioned, A for aging, B for birth rates, C for China, and D for distribution, are working in the opposite direction. Will they continue? I'll leave that as an open question. Now, the standard model says big deficits, interest rates should go up. This is what the CBO, this is the same chart I showed you before, but the squiggly upward sloping lines are CBO's predictions. So if you look at the first line on top with the black dots, in 2008, CBO said in 2020, our interest rates will be 5.6%. Well, that was wrong. In 2014, CBO said our interest rates will be 4.6% in 2020. Well, that was wrong. In 2018, CBO said our interest rates will be 1.9%. Well, they're getting a little better. But the point is that CBO and everybody else, not to blame CBO, but what all economists have been predicting are higher interest rates. The problem is they just don't happen. So now just because we've been wrong all the time doesn't mean we're going to be wrong again. In fact, I would make the same forecast as they have there. But all I can tell you is, as much as reason tells me that we should expect higher interest rates, I don't know if it's going to happen because I've been wrong before, as you can see from every one of these predictions. So let's see. Just going to take a few more minutes of your time, and then we can open it up to questions. Okay. I just want to talk about the Biden recovery plan for a minute on the corporate side. So just look at the left-hand side, and you can see the five main elements of corporate taxation, for corporate taxation that Biden has in mind, at least so far as we know it. Now, right now, folks at Treasury are burning the midnight oil, constructing their real plan, and we'll have that out, who knows, maybe a month or two from now. It'll come out in the form of a green book, which hasn't been published in 4 years. But this is what we know so far. Mr. Biden plans to raise the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. He's going to have this funky Made in America tax credit, which is a tax credit for a whole bunch of stuff, which I don't think can be defined, but let me just give you a couple clues. It's going to be a 10% tax credit for rehabilitating factories that are getting old. It's going to be a tax credit for spending money to open closed factories. It's going to be a tax credit for bringing investment back into the United States. It's going to be a tax credit for salary increases. and it's going to be a tax credit for investment increases. Now, how you define any one of those, much less all 5 of those, is very problematic. But basically, it's a tax credit for domestic stuff. And we'll have to see how they spec that out. So we have a tax increase with the corporate rate up. Then we have a tax cut with the Made in America tax credit. Now we're going to have another tax increase on the international side, where the GILTI, the global intangible low taxed income rate, which now is effectively, just speaking generally, 10.5%. They want to raise that to 21%. So we'd have 28% domestic and 21% foreign. Then they would eliminate the QBI, which is 10% of tangible assets. So that gives some relief to folks with machinery and equipment and plant in foreign jurisdictions. And then we would move from an overall limitation to a per country limitation, which prevents or helps prevent cross-crediting, where you use low tax foreign income can escape the GILTI minimum tax by being blended in with high tax income. The fourth component of Mr. Biden's plan is a surcharge on import income. It's it's basically a tariff, but it would be a tariff that only applies to US-based companies. So we economists don't like tariffs. If you have to have a tariff, why would you just put it on US-based companies? I don't know, but maybe they'll figure that out. And then finally, we have the item which is getting a lot of attention, which is a 15% on minimum tax on book income. Now, this is an item which I think it's intuitive to non-tax people that this would be great. It's going to be wonderful. Well, 2 things to point out is, one is it's very difficult to implement in practice and is wacky. But the other thing is, if you already have the first 4 items, in particular, the raising the corporate rate to 28% and increasing the GILTI, well, you don't need a minimum tax anymore because nobody's going to be paying less than 15%, or just rarely will it occur. So this is kind of a push and pull plan, which is all over the place. We economists, we don't like increases in the corporate tax rate. So we'd rather see that not happen. A minimum tax is just awful tax policy. Just fix the tax system that you have. Don't put another tax system. Don't give me 2 bad tax systems. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Fix the first one. Now, because I'm an economist, I crunched some numbers, very crude numbers, but it's a pretty crude proposal, so it's fair. And what I came up with is you probably could do, if you're in favor of the Biden policy objectives, which is to raise corporate taxes, then you could do it a hell of a lot easier. You could keep the corporate rate at 21% or close to 21%. Okay, so that's good. You get rid of that Made in America tax credit because it's just not administrable. Now on the GILTI, if you're going to increase the GILTI so much as they're talking about, you might as well just go to worldwide taxation. I'm not advocating that, but if you're going to go there, why, and if you can keep the rate low, like at 21%, why not have worldwide taxation with 21%? And then I would just get rid of the FDII because it's a nightmare from a policy and administrative perspective. So that's my smart aleck idea for doing the Biden plan a lot more simply. Okay, so Jim, I'm just going to leave it there. I've been talking too long, so.
Actually, Marty, I think we could listen to you for a lot longer, and I think all of us appreciate the perspective that you've offered on the Biden corporate tax plan. Before opening it to the questions that have been posed from our attendees, the issue of the long-term debt is always something that I've thought about and been concerned with, as I'm sure many of us have. In your observation about the debt to GDP ratio staying stable for the next 7 years, but the question about later and the potential that the debt will explode. The question that I think lurks out there related to this long-term debt is, the impact on the ability of the US dollar to retain its status as the world's reserve currency. Any thoughts you want to share on that?
Well, that's not my specialty, but whenever anybody says bad things about my country's financial condition, I always go, "What's the alternative?" So, is it Bitcoin or is it the Chinese currency? It just doesn't seem possible. Now, I've been wrong many times. I remember a few years ago, somebody said to me, "When do you think the U.S. is going to lose its AAA credit rating?" And I said, "Oh, in about 5 years." And then the next day, it lost its credit rating. So it's, what Yogi Berra said, it's very hard to predict, especially about the future.
So we've had a few questions posed, Marty, about the Fed. I'll just combine two of them. How is the Fed policy affecting the availability of money and interest rates? And then, in your opinion, is the Fed losing its political independence?
What was the last one?
In your opinion, is the Fed losing its political independence?
Oh, if you watch the financial programs that are on TV all day, all they talk about is the Fed and the interest rates. And from a very short-term perspective, if you're investing, that's extremely important, because when interest rates go up, the stock market is going to go down. And so that's why you're going to be a Fed watcher, because that's going to matter, especially if you're trading on a very short-term basis. But in the longer run, let's say like a year, a horizon beyond a year, the Fed is not a leader, but a follower on interest rates. Okay? The Fed cannot say tomorrow, we want to raise interest rates to 15%. Or if interest rates were, well, they can't go any lower, but if interest rates were at 5, they can only do that for a short period of time. There's an equilibrium interest rate in the economy that depends on real stuff and not on what the Fed does. So the Fed has tremendous influence over the very short-term interest rates. But if you want to look at interest rates 10 years from now, you're going to have to look at the fundamentals underlying that. About the politicization of the Fed, there used to be a time when there really was a big wall between the Fed and the Treasury. So, for example, they kept themselves very separate. They had very separate policies. Then it was the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. Alan Greenspan started weighing in, giving his opinion on capital gains tax cut. He thought that was a very good thing. And then in the second Bush administration, when believe it or not, the debt to GDP ratio was predicted to go to 0 because we just had the dot-com boom. And he said, no, we don't want to do that. That's because we need to have government debt for the markets to be liquid and so forth. So more and more, so where in the 1960s and 1970s, you never would have had that type of interference. Now you're having more and more. Right now, Janet Yellen used to be Fed chairman, and Mr. Powell has taken over. They seem to be exactly on the same, singing exactly the same tune. Certainly, Mr. Powell is very supportive of the stimulus. Now, I believe some people believe that is because he's been sort of co-opted by the administration. I don't know, but I believe there is a strong case for stimulus. And so now there's strong counter argument to it as well, but I don't think it's politically motivated. I think he genuinely believes that we need to have stimulus now. And part of that is a long-term frustration from, you hear the European Central Bank as well. The monetary authorities throughout the world have been trying to fight the last recession and this current recession with monetary policy. They've done everything in the playbook. They have nothing, they have no ammunition left. They've pulled every lever they can pull. And so what they're saying now, and it's not so much a political statement, but it's just, hey, we can't do anymore. You got to do it. You got to do it on the fiscal side. So I think it's all understandable.
Well, Marty, mentioning that last part, the concern about inflation.
Yeah.
I mean, once you have that inflation genie out of the bottle, with the Fed having shot all of its bullets, how do you get that back in?
Well, the Fed has shot all its bullets in one direction, which is it can't stimulate anymore. But they say it's like pushing on a string. So you can't push down anymore on this, but you can pull back. So the Fed does have the ability, at least in the short term, to slam on the brakes and prevent inflation. Now that'd be very painful because it might cause another recession. So there's the concern about inflation. Let me just break it into parts. One is it might not happen. Okay, there's very good indications that it will. Every model will say it's going to happen. But just like those interest rate rises, and Powell even said it. He said, we're not going to do anything based on predictions. It's got to actually happen. So when inflation gets over 2%, then they might start thinking about tightening the reins. But it has to happen. And so one is it might not happen for reasons that we don't understand, but it might not happen. The other is, as you're inferring, is if there is a rise in interest rates, well, maybe the Fed can pull back. So, and we'll have time, because you won't, unless inflation is maintained for 3 or 4, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, we're not really worried about it being sustained. It might be a one shot, and people are comparing this to the one shot inflation that we had during the Korean War. And then the third thing about worrying about inflation is you might go, well, you have to make a decision about whether you're going to accept unemployment or inflation, which is worse. We don't like either one. But if I was one of those 8.6 million people out of a job, I'd be like, okay, I like a little bit of inflation. I'd like to have an overheated economy. So again, when you watch those news programs, they're obsessed with it because it's going to directly feed into the short-term interest rate, which is directly going to feed into the stock prices. So if you're a day trader, you got to watch that stuff and you got to be concerned about it. But for regular people out on the street, would 4% inflation, we in our lifetime, Jim, we've seen more than that. Would 4% inflation be the end of the world if we had full employment? That's everybody's entitled to their opinion on that.
Well, great thought there, Marty. Let's switch gears. There's a question from the audience about potential repeal of the capital gains rate. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of a scary thought for folks with a lot of stocks that they're going to hold till death. The reason to be concerned that it might happen is you have the far Democratic left pulling for a wealth tax. Now, a wealth tax is not a good idea because it's not administrable. But the other thing is, it's like another alternative minimum tax. It's like, well, our income tax system is leaky, so we're going to throw another tax on there. And what I keep coming back to is, why not fix the system you have? And the way to if you're really concerned about wealth accumulation, maybe you're not, but if you are, and that's the direction you're going in, the obvious thing to do is to fix the capital gains loopholes. And the biggest loophole, of course, is capital gains at death. If that would be a pretty good substitute for a wealth tax. So I can see what happens is maybe you have 50, 60 Democrats in the House screaming for a wealth tax, and they get really angry when you don't do it. So they go, okay, we'll compromise. We'll just do a capital gains tax cut, increase. So now, as monumental as that change would be, including the rate increase, so they would do 4 things. One is get rid of carried interest capital gains rate. One is to get rid of like-kind exchanges. And if that happens to be your line of business, it's a huge deal, but it's not a huge deal from a revenue point of view. And the other is to raise the capital gains rate. And then the other is to get rid of capital gains at death. Those are big changes for folks, but they don't raise a lot of revenue in the short term. So when you're doing legislation, when the rubber hits the road, it may not be worth the political pain for the amount of revenue that you get. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It will certainly pass the House in 10 seconds. Or maybe, well, no, I take that back. Because the margin in the House is closer, that, I think it's only like 19 votes. So if you had some moderate Democrats, you might not get through the House, but I think it could get through the House. Then the question is, what does the Senate want? What does Joe Manchin want in West Virginia and the other moderate Democrats want to make this bill go through? And if Senator Manchin happens to be the swing vote and he goes, well, not many folks in West Virginia have a lot of capital gains, so I'm going to let that one slide, but I'm going to get something else in return for that. I could see it passing. So I don't know if you want the political analysis or the economic analysis. It wouldn't be the end of the world for the economy, that's for sure. It might create a lot of tumult in the stock market if everybody tries to sell before the effective date. So sure. That's one thing I can't even fathom that, but I think it would be large, and I'd be nervous about that.
Right. Well, staying on the subject of capital gains, the question came in, would they change the capital gains for all amounts at death, or just plus $6 million plus where the estate tax starts? Is there a significant difference between the two?
The answer is yes. I mean, we don't, I think all of those things are on the table. Now, the new assistant secretary appointed, she is an expert on inheritance tax. And so maybe they'll have some bold proposal to entirely change the whole shebang. That's a lot to do in a month or two. So I just think anything can happen, and all those possibilities. In fact, I think when the Green Book comes out, we're going to have a tidal wave of lobbying to adjust this. First of all, the House is going to want to do its own thing. The Senate's going to want to do its own thing. There's going to be a hell of a lot of lobbying at the Treasury, in the House, and in the Senate. And how it's all going to play out, I don't know. Unless the whole thing. Now, the other major factor, and that's why we're talking economics, is we want to have a tax increase when we have 8.6 million people unemployed. And Mark Mazur, the acting assistant secretary of Treasury for tax policy, and Janet Yellen herself said it during her confirmation hearing, I can't remember the exact words, but it's very unlikely we're going to have a tax increase this year because of the economy. Okay, well then when? So if you're going to pass something now and say, oh, well, next year we're going to raise the rate. Well, we know what happens when that happens. Everybody's going to be doing a lot of income shifting from year to year. It's going to be a nightmare. But especially on the capital gains piece, everybody's going to be selling like crazy. And if you had I would just be afraid if that happened and something else bad happened at the same time, that could be pretty devastating to the market, which is a little high right now, I'd say.
Right. We had a panel yesterday, Marty, talking about the Green Book coming out, and I think the consensus was that it won't happen in April, probably back towards May or June. But obviously, it's a matter of great concern to members of TEI. And so we have our tax reform task force fully engaged and ready to work with members on what to do as these things progress. Switching gears a little bit to a general economist model about the impact on jobs from increasing the corporate tax rates. Any comments there?
Well, I think the Tax Foundation has done some estimates on that. Frankly, I think they're usually a little high in terms of the tax effects that occur. I think I think increasing the corporate rate is not good for the economy. It is a poor way of taxing. I mean, the idea is you want to tax wealthy people. That's ultimately what you want to do. You don't want to tax corporations. So if you, and this is another reason why capital gains taxation makes more sense than raising the corporate tax. Because if, again, if your goal is to increase the burden on the wealthy, to increase the progressivity of the system, it's much better done at the individual level than at the corporate level. The corporate tax rate increase will provide an incentive for firms to invert. It will provide an incentive. It will be obviously less of interest, less interest in increasing jobs. You know, to what degree that would occur, I don't think it's going to be very major. I mean, we had a 35% rate before, and life went on. But I do think, for not just for job reasons, but for a whole host of reasons, we should keep the corporate rate as low as possible. So yeah, but there will be adverse economic effects. It's not advisable.
Marty, you'll enjoy this next question. Why not implement a 5% federal sales tax, or GST, to address the deficit or to fund spending initiatives, assuming that you can exempt food or other essential products so it won't hurt the lower income folks?
Well, first of all, I would probably do a value-added tax instead of a GST, but putting that detail aside, it's a damn good idea. You know, I don't believe we have to pay for the stimulus, because it wouldn't be stimulus then. And I don't believe we even have to pay for the infrastructure. That'd make me a radical, real outlier. Because again, if we're investing in good stuff, that should be done. But what we do have to pay for is our long-term spending binge, which is mostly in the form of Social Security and Medicare. That needs to be paid for. If we don't do something about that, those little spirals that we're showing are going to happen. And that's, again, that's demography. It's like the only thing we can really predict the future. So yeah, we need to do that. The exemptions for food and clothing and whatever and necessities, that's sort of a more of a political window dressing. It's a much better idea to, this is what they do in New Zealand. You just have a very, very broad base, no exceptions, and then just give low income people direct payments, because you know, rich people eat food, buy clothing too, and so it's a needless and complex way of implementing a consumption tax.
Right. Well, Marty, you know, in the tax community, we keep hearing more and more folks say it's a question not now of if, but when, given those demographics that you mentioned. So,
well, somebody said to me, "What do you think about the carbon tax? You know, we need the money, and you know, everybody wants green." Go to a more green economy. Wouldn't that be ideal? I said, definitely ideal. And I think the odds have greatly improved from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100. You know, these taxes are, you know, just people are not rational about these things. You know, just as they love raising taxes on corporations, it's like always polls at 70-75%. People love to do this, even though every economist will tell you you shouldn't do it. That shows you how much respect we get. And the same thing on a value-added tax and a carbon tax. These are very, to the extent any tax is good, these are very good ideas. But you know, you try voting for that, and then you're running for re-election. You know, it's difficult, as you know.
well, Marty, I think we've run out of questions from the audience, at least those in the queue. And I just want to thank you for covering all the ground that you did. I think it was a wonderful discussion, and you certainly educated us on a variety of issues once again. I want to thank you for your insights that you shared with us. And on behalf of TEI, thank you for your time and effort.
Oh, my pleasure.
The conference will again commence at 12:30 Eastern Time. And we thank you all for your participation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. We appreciate you being on with us today.
Thank you, Pilar.
It was great to have you. That was a wonderful session. We really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, go have a nice lunch now.
Thanks. Enjoy your afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.